Hey, happy Friday and happy 100th Feature Friday at that. In kind of on-brand fashion, I ended up preparing nothing special for today other than a really excellent book to talk about. So again, just to reiterate the sentiments of last week, especially if I didn't catch you last week, just wanted to thank you if you have popped over for any book chat on a Feature Friday, which if you are here, you have, and just thank you for the opportunity to talk about a book every week. It boggles my mind a little bit still that people are interested in what I have to say, and I am incredibly grateful for that and never take that for granted. And with that, we have a perfect selection for the 100th Feature Friday, which was as much fate and the way the library holds played out as anything, and that is The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. Here we're going to start untangling the woven threads of lies and legends in this dark, atmospheric fairy tale that is really bolstered by Chokshi's really iconic and lush prose. So if you like languid prose, secrets hidden in shadows, and florid writing that kind of dances around the heart of the matter and in equal parts obscures and illuminates, I think this is going to be right up your alley. And I think the prose style is going to be the kind of deciding factor for a lot of readers. It is lush. It kind of borders on the precipice of purple for some people potentially. For me, it harkens back to The Star-Touched Queen, which is the first of Chokshi's work that I fell in love with, though now she is admittedly and deservedly a little more well known for things like Aru Shah. But this kind of winding and fairy tale-esque prose really sets the tone for this book and makes it a fairy tale in some ways. And in that vein as well, it puts us as readers at a slight distance. And not for me personally, a distance like I've talked about before, where I feel like I'm not really immersed in this story or I'm being kept at arm's length somehow. Here there's a sense of that arm's length, but it's always very intentional with the prose because we are very much exploring the ideas of the in-between and the liminal here, but in a way that we can't really trust and we don't know what to trust. And this is further emphasized by this reoccurring fairy tale imagery and this harkening back to fairy tales specifically and to some of the darkest fairy tales as we move throughout the story. And we are pulled into this world by the bridegroom, who is never named, but he is a scholar of legend and tales, so we are set at this kind of remove from reality from the outset. And even the introduction, when we're still kind of in the real world, when we get our first glimpse of the bridegroom and his meeting with Indigo, who will become his wife and the kind of center of everything, even then there is this sense of the mystical to everything. It feels like it kind of wants to be rooted in the late 90s, but even as it gives us little peeks of these touchstones, it introduces us to characters who operate outside of the world as we would inhabit it and live in this world of legend and fairy tales. And from the outset, when the bridegroom and Indigo meet, they are introduced to each other and fall into each other in relation to the Eros and Psyche myth, which if you've been here for a second, you know I absolutely love. And so kind of setting up their relationship around this myth, even if we travel to different stories throughout the book, but it sets itself around this idea of this grand love that is built on secrets, the revelation of a true face, and then having to fight for that love and prove yourself worthy of that love in some way. And that really is the full shape of the thing at the end of the day. And the style of writing makes it so us as readers are really pulled into the tale of everything. And we're willing to kind of go with that suspension of disbelief and believe the magic of the world, even as we're questioning it, as things start to kind of appear different in different lights, as the prose itself introduces doubt. It also makes these characters a little bit unknowable, but in a way that feels familiar to us as readers and doesn't feel like poor character development, because it isn't. Especially because the shape of the thing is really all about that revelation of the face, the discovering of ourself. And it's also about secrets and oaths, because with Eros and Psyche, everything is spurred into motion by the act of breaking the oath of not looking at Eros at night. And here Indigo has gotten a promise from the bridegroom that he will not dig into her past. So they meet because he is on the hunt for a manuscript in her collection, and his interest in stories, in tales, in legends is spurred on by the fact that when he was a boy, he has this vivid recollection of his brother. He remembers their kind of imaginative play worlds so specifically, and he remembers his brother kind of going into the closet, going into the armoire, going into the wardrobe. And then after that, he remembers his mother telling him, "You never had a brother. What are you talking about?" And so his real interest in fairy tales lies with this idea of transmutation that exists in fairy tales, and this idea, this certainty he has that he had a brother even as he knows logically he never did, and this idea that fairy tales will illuminate some kind of truth for him, that he can find the answer if he just finds the right story. And so that sets out this expectation early on, both the way that stories can shape our reality and how our reality is shaped and morphed by the stories we tell, and also how stories kind of obscure reality in some ways. And so after this meeting, the bridegroom and Indigo kind of have a whirlwind romance, fall in love very quickly, and spend the next kind of 3 years in this almost honeymoon period of sorts. And then Indigo is called home to the estate she grew up in, where her aunt is dying. And even in that honeymoon period, there is a sense that they're not really in reality. And also Indigo has secured this promise from the bridegroom that he will not dig into her past. So when they have to go back to the House of Dreams, this is kind of brought back to the forefront, especially because they are at the hotel that they're staying in before they kind of establish themselves at the house. They're not staying at the house proper. There is still that distance created by the house, but also the way that the house is calling to both of them in different ways. While they are there, Indigo is mistaken for Azure, which kind of opens up all of the windows of possibility and questions that the bridegroom has, because this is the window, the threshold into Indigo's past and the making of her. But there's also this incredible sense that the answers there are dangerous, and as he's pulled deeper into the house, he has this sense that the house is offering him this bargain, this idea that if he finds the answers to what happened between these two girls that were by all reports inseparable in childhood, he will get answers into what happened to his brother. And so as he's kind of skirting the line of breaking this oath to Indigo, while also exploring how breaking of oaths are so central to so many of these tales, we as readers are then given Azure's point of view, and it moves back and forth between the two. And so we can feel everything leading up to this moment of discovery, but at the same time, we are watching these two lost and lonely girls grow together. And we both get to know Indigo a little bit better and also still feel at arm's length from her, which is where I think that the fairy tale nature of the writing really serves the story, because as readers, the discovery of Indigo, the understanding of Indigo, the unraveling of Indigo is the story. And yet in the flashbacks, in this first person point of view, Azure comes to life so vividly and makes us wonder, or made me wonder as a reader, even more what happened to her. And we're watching her draw closer and closer to Indigo in childhood, how Indigo kind of comes to her when she is at her loneliest. Azure has just moved to town with her mother and her stepfather, and her stepfather is not a great guy. There's a reason that the narrative starts referencing fairy tales where fathers prey on daughters. And so Indigo offers this escape, and this house offers this escape, and it is this wonderland of sorts, or this other world as it comes to be called, as Indigo and Azure move closer and closer to each other and further away from the outside world. And what started as this kind of imaginative play when they were younger, that they were these cast out fae, becomes truth to Indigo as they get older, and she's convinced that they are meant to step into the other world fully when they graduate. And they've been playing in this kind of space for years, this kind of fairy realm that is all their own. And I think that this is so interesting, particularly in this book, because it is playing with that idea of another world, of this magical realm, this kind of portal fantasy of sorts, but in a warped kind of way. And the narrative really starts to ask us whether we are seeing what we think we're seeing. It presents these kind of fairy tale elements that our narrators fully believe in, this kind of magic and wonder, but it presents it with this kind of slant, this idea that something is just slightly off. It's a feeling that feels a little hard to articulate, but it's like you're walking down a kind of moody, dark corridor and something feels malevolent lurking in the shadows, but then a stream of sunlight comes through the window and you just see the dust kind of floating in the air and there's nothing hiding in the corner. It's that kind of feeling where we're kind of constantly mistrusting our own judgment, which goes back to fairy tales as well, because while they have this kind of magic and wonder to them, it is wonder born of the kind of dark and the grotesque. It goes back to fairy tale roots of ways to present warnings and kind of socialize children out of behavior that may put them in danger. And so here's a way to explore those kind of harsher and harder realities through that lens, a way to kind of disassociate for them a little bit as well. As this codependent relationship builds between Indigo and Azure, it's kind of unclear how much of this is a game and how desperately Indigo in particular is grasping at these stories in the same way that her and the bridegroom will exchange stories later. And so so stories are used for both revelation and obstruction, and to keep the reader on their toes. For instance, I called the twist, the revelation, the secret, whatever we want to call it, about midway through the book. But the way the prose worked, the way that the narrative was always kind of trying to get us to second guess our perception and the reality of what was going on, in that way I also second guessed this revelation. And to be clear, I think I was supposed to guess that revelation earlier on than you would typically think, though if you don't catch on till later, I think it is still a lot of fun and will still pack a punch. But all of the pieces were kind of laid out, the clues were sprinkled in, and so in much the same way that the narrative is trying to get us to question our perception, question our reality, having our characters question their reality, I think that we as readers are supposed to question whether that revelation is the truth. It's setting up these pieces that kind of lock it in, then it's slanting the light at new angles and going, well, maybe, but what if? And then you're kind of left guessing, and you can't trust, or I started to distrust, my own perception and intuition as a reader as these myths and legends kind of wove through more crass realities and kind of kept us in this limbo. And this liminal space, this limbo, this sense of unknowing is where we're kept for a lot of the book, but also especially this idea of the other world and a space outside of the realm of the normal. For Indigo and Azure, particularly the other world, as they call it, and we see them play in what they think is this fairy realm, and we see them reference kind of fey creatures particularly, and so we sense them in this space, but at the same time, as readers, we never really see them in direct light, so it's part of that kind of questioning of our perception. So in some ways, in terms of this other space, this kind of running away from reality and existing outside of it with your closest friends, there I kind of got the sense of A Great and Terrible Beauty, or the Great and Terrible Beauty series by Libba Bray that came out when I was a teenager. Now, to be fair, I haven't read that series in a long time, and I don't know how well it holds up, particularly in relation to like its exploration of colonialism in India and the relationship between Britain and India in regards to that. However, in terms of this other world that is presented there, we see these young women escaping to this world that is all their own. It's a place that they can control and they can be in charge, and they have power in some ways, and sometimes in ways they don't in their real life. And it's also an exploration of the complexities of female friendship, female relationships, and it's all tinged with that kind of sense of danger and also the kind of looming reality of the end of adolescence, of growing up. And that is so central to what is being explored here explicitly. The girls repeatedly refer to this idea of being a cast-out Susan, referring back to Susan Pevensey in the Chronicles of Narnia, and it is Indigo's greatest fear, which is extra interesting in terms of where we know she ends up with the bridegroom. So in this direct reference to Susan, it's this idea that you are punished, you are kicked out, you are robbed of that magic for growing up, for kind of looking to the outside world. And I don't know if this has been an actual kind of recent trend for that reclaiming of Susan, or if it's just something I'm a lot more aware of because now I am a Susan, but I love this kind of reconsideration of Susan, this kind of justice for Susan Pevensey moment, which I think is distilled really well in this paragraph I would like to read for you, if that is okay. If not, skip ahead slightly, I'm gonna do it anyway. So it says, I thought of Susan Pevensey, grown old, her lipstick smearing outside the lines of her mouth. Who was to say she didn't stretch her neck from side to side, hang up her nylon stockings in her closet, press her palm to the back of her wardrobe, and say, now I'll go? Who was to say she didn't know exactly where the lantern in the snow waited for her? What if every time she opened a closet she saw a path lit by fireflies and merely chose to reach for her scarf instead of that secret doorknob? And so this book kind of really subtly explores the kind of choices inherent in fairy tales, which seems kind of counterintuitive because everything is pretty kind of surface level in terms of the fairy tales. The bridegroom kind of recenters and reintroduces these kind of overarching explorations or the tropes or the themes that we run into again and again in fairy tales, and those are kind of positioned against the wider narrative of the story. However, those slightly more obvious moments, which I also love, I think just further also underscore the kind of subtle intricacies of some of the quieter moments. And this is a quieter novel in a lot of ways because it's about catching things in different slants of light, how things can be seen differently through different lenses, and the stories we tell ourselves to make our secrets bearable, and the kind of like souls that can keep those secrets with us or see those secrets in their fullness. And the secret at the heart of this is what has happened to Azure, and is it the story we expect to hear? And like I said, Chakshi's beautiful writing is the perfect way to tell that story. So if you've read this, I would love to hear your thoughts. There are so many subtleties to this to dig into. There is such a lush atmosphere to languish in. And if you read it, I'm sure like me, you were left with a lot to ponder. So if you need a place to ponder, ponder away. But again, thank you for 100 Feature Fridays, 100 books, 100 chats. Thanks for hanging out. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.